Good morning. Welcome to the New Frontier. Today we're talking about inflation, specifically inflation as it relates to House Bill 150 in Minnesota. Now, here we attempt to add just another grain of information to the vast ocean of knowledge that is the internet, specifically as it relates to public policy. Today we have a really interesting one. I have to bring you all the way back to the year 2000 to really make this make sense. So, in the year 2000, in the great state of Minnesota, there was an independent governor, a rare thing to have. Jesse Ventura, also a pro wrestler. Jesse Ventura wanted the budget balanced. He was not running for re election, but the two people in charge of the budget both were. They wanted to run on the premise of having a balanced budget and erasing a $1.9 billion deficit that the state had accumulated. So, how are they going to cut costs? Were they going to raise taxes? How were they going to make this work? They decided that they would go ahead and make a budget that did not account for inflation. Now, inflation in economic terms is just the general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing value of money over time. And this occurs just because of the general increase in the price of living over time. So, what buys you a cup of milk today will not buy you a cup of milk 2 and 3 years from now, generally because there's a 1.5 to 3% inflation rate in America. In other countries, it's way higher. You can go all the way to places like Zimbabwe, where inflation rates sometimes are 100% or more, or have been historically. In America, we don't have to worry about that, but inflation is still a huge deal. And if you try to calculate a budget, say 20 years out, that didn't account for inflation, it would be vastly underestimating the cost of operating the government and would force the government to either continually cut costs or cut the resources they provide to society, or increase taxes every year to account for that inflation. So basically what I'm saying is eventually inflation is going to have to be calculated either way. It's almost just a political ploy not to account for inflation in the first place. So the House and the Senate, they propose this budget plan, and the governor vetoes it. And he specifically says you're attempting to wish away inflation, but inflation is going to exist either way. So, you should probably just account for inflation. The House and Senate overruled the veto and implemented a spending bill anyways that would balance the budget by not counting in inflation. Now, flash forward 20 years later, and the money given to schools to pay for students, some $600-ish per student, is 10 times less than schools need per student. The money set aside to repair roads and pay salaries is multiples less than it needs to be because the 1.9% inflation or what have you was not calculated in over the course of time of 20 years, which is insane. That's why first year teachers in Minnesota only make about $10,000 less than 12 plus year teachers with master's degrees. Like, the almost no increase in salary exists for teachers and state employees and things of that nature. So, Minnesota senators got together and said they would propose a bill that would mandate inflation be calculated into the budget. The actual language of the bill, I did find an excerpt. It says that previously, in the law, this was enacted when the budget was passed. This is the previous legislation. I mean, I have to read it because of how crazy it is that this was written into law. Minnesota Statute Section 16A103 stated, expenditure estimates must not include an allocation for inflation. Now, if this House Bill 150 would get passed, it would read, expenditures must be estimated for all obligations imposed by law and those projected to occur as a result of inflation and variables outside of the control of the legislature. Now, you may think to yourself, if you were writing a budget, you would just calculate in inflation. It shouldn't need to be codified. But unfortunately, in Minnesota, it does. The crazier part is that this bill is unlikely, or so I've read, to pass. So, if you think there's a chance that your senators are just now learning about inflation, reach out to them, remind them what this concept is. Not everyone has a background in economics or finance, but you may be in high school learning about inflation or in college. Let your senators know what you think about this bill and ask them, does our budget account for inflation? Are we trying to reach a balanced budget? Things of that nature. Just inquire. It's your job in our representative democracy to have an opinion so that the public servants in our government can represent you. The only way this can work is if you first have formed an opinion on public policy. This one, I can tell you, should be in law. I'm going to take that step back. I take a nonpartisan approach at public policy, and I don't give my opinion. But just from a basic logical standpoint, inflation should be calculated into the budget because it exists, therefore it should be accounted for. This law should not be in place because it shouldn't be necessary to codify everything, to put everything into state code, state law. This should be more common sense than necessarily in legislation. But if we have a state that is determining that they do not want to include all variables necessary to have a complete budget, maybe it needs to be codified. That's up to you. Let me know what you think about this story because it is so interesting in the comments. Alright, guys, have a good one.